This isn't the first time I've spoken at Birkbeck. I've been invited a few times, and it's always a tremendous honor and pleasure to be here. David Feldman always organizes fascinating conferences on wide-ranging themes and quite courageous as well in terms of subject matter and the mix of people whom he invites. It's a real intellectual treat to be here, and I'm very grateful to have been invited again. So we're accustomed to defining nationalism as an ideology or as a means of identification, but I would propose that we conceive of nationalism as a form of emotional self-medication. Its narrative of a sempiternal community offers, if not a cure, then at least a tonic to allay the fear of death. The notion that one does belong to a certain nation and that others do not both enables and provides shelter from social marginalization or exclusion, which scholars have tellingly termed social death. The nationalist idea also provides justification and rationalization for feelings such as resentment, hatred, anger, loneliness, anxiety, guilt, and shame. Last but not least, nationalism is the continuation of eros by other means. It both co-opts and supplants the romantic love that joins humans into long-lasting pair bonds and makes possible the continuation of the species. These emotionally therapeutic qualities of nationalism are readily apparent in Zionism. Like other forms of nationalism, Zionism employs ideology to sustain an emotional community united by negative emotions as well as positive ones, such as love, hope, and pride. Zionism's emotional register has been deeply influenced by the presence, absence, and nature of ambient anti-Semitism. Like other forms of racism, anti-Semitism provides an ideological veneer for emotions such as fear, resentment, despair, and shame. This evening I wish to explore the interaction between two powerful affective forces, Zionism and anti-Semitism, using as a case study Zionist diplomacy from the mid-1890s until the early 1920s. That is, from the outset of Theodor Herzl's brief but meteoric Zionist career to the wartime Zionist leadership of Chaim Weizmann, the issuing of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and both Zionist and anti-Semitic reactions to that transformational event. Possessed of radically different personalities and operating under different geopolitical circumstances, Herzl elevated anti-Semitism into an ideology, while Chaim Weizmann engaged with it as an emotion. Conversely, at first anti-Semites saw in Zionism a source of emotional relief, but in the aftermath of World War I and the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, they incorporated Zionism into an increasingly monolithic and ominous ideology. Now let me begin with defining terms. What do I mean by ideology and emotion? By ideology, I mean a coherent and sustained interpretation of experience in terms of fundamental beliefs and values. Ideologies function via both deductive and inductive logic, first principles and empirical observation. They lay claim to rationality, although in fact, they need not be rational. This definition goes beyond Marxist or neo-Marxist associations of ideology as the belief system of dominant classes and reflective of their economic interests. It encompasses religion, broadly understood, and all of the systematic political systems of late modernity, such as liberalism, communism, and fascism. By this rubric, both anti-Semitism and Zionism can be classified as ideologies, but an individual who defines herself or who is defined by others as anti-Semitic or as Zionist does not necessarily structure her interpretive universe around either of these isms. That is, one can have an aversion to Jews but not perceive history as an eternal struggle between Jews and Gentiles. Similarly, one can feel an identification with or an attachment to the state of Israel without defining oneself exclusively in terms of Zionism. The term Zionist has often been employed as a pejorative in the Stalinist Soviet Union and throughout the Arab world and in leftist academic circles throughout the Western world. Conversely, the word anti-Semite has at times been brandished with pride, particularly in German-speaking Europe, from the 1880s through 1945. That said, for the past century, the word anti-Semite has usually been associated with opprobrium, to the point that in our own era it is not uncommon for people who hate Jews to deny that they're anti-Semites. Zionism is sometimes considered to be a bad thing, but anti-Semitism is almost always thought to be a bad thing. For this reason, only a committed Jew hater would be willing to take on the opprobrium associated with publicly identifying as an anti-Semite. Because the word Zionism is somewhat less charged, it is more common for individuals to identify as Zionists if they support the State of Israel to some degree, even if they don't structure their lives around commitment to its well-being. Ideology can have unconscious sources. It is therefore not sealed off from feeling. Going back to the days of Freud and William James, people have debated about the seat of emotion, in the psyche or in the body, whether it is culturally constructed or common to all humans, and whether it is a hallmark of the primitive, which in the Western world was subdued via a civilizing process, or whether it is always present but performed in changing ways. Talking about how emotion is performed, however, does not get us any closer to defining what emotion is. We could call it irrational or non-rational cognition and volition. We often justify our emotions, however, in terms of reality and logic. Besides, people can base logical argumentation on preposterous assumptions or draw conclusions from biased observations. An emotion, then, is no more or less rational than a concept or an idea. Moreover, both emotion and ideology are expressed through language. The difference between the two is that emotion begins with inchoate feeling, which is after the fact, although at times scant milliseconds thereafter, expressed via language, whereas ideology is encased in language, which then elicits emotional reactions. Emotions are a form of thought, and thought is only intelligible once it has been put into words. But the words that we use to describe our thoughts and the actions we take as a result from them vary greatly across time and space. So I suggest we abandon references to rationality altogether, and following a wide range of scholars from the philosopher and ethicist Martha Nussbaum to the political scientist Roger Peterson, define emotion as psychological mechanisms that regulate the intensity and the saliency of desire. I would embellish that definition by classifying negative emotions, such as fear, resentment, hatred, rage, and jealousy, as expressions of disequilibrium and unfulfilled desire. So that's what I mean by negative emotions, disequilibrium and unfulfilled desire. As opposed to positive emotions, such as pride, contentment, and magnanimity, as expressions of equilibrium, of having achieved or being in imminent expectation of achieving wants and needs. By this view, love is the most liminal emotion, as it can indicate both fulfilled and unfulfilled desire. On this view, anti-Semitism is a verbalization of disequilibrium and unfulfilled desire, whereas Zionism combines aspects of disequilibrium and equilibrium, of longing and fulfillment. They are equally affective in origin, but they draw upon differing affective palettes. So that's what I mean by ideology and emotion. And now let's talk about Zionism and anti-Semitism. Let's start with the relationship between affect and ideology and Theodor Herzl's Zionism and the extent to which Herzl's Zionism was a product of anti-Semitism. This second question is a bit easier to answer, although my argument may appear counterintuitive, because I do not believe that anti-Semitism can do more than partially account for Herzl's turn to Zionism. On the one hand, the connection between anti-Semitism and the embrace of Zionism appears obvious. As a university student and later as a state attorney, Herzl endured disturbing anti-Semitic incidents, and at the age of 22, he was badly shaken by Eugen Döring's anti-Semitic screed, Die Judenfrage als Frage des Rassencharakters und seiner Schädlichkeit für die Existenz und Kultur des Volkes. It was probably just the title that terrified him. It's all one word, by the way, in German. Herzl did not, however, react in any sustained way to anti-Semitic slights until 1893. And rather than adopt Jewish nationalism, he fantasized about both Jewish mass conversions to Catholicism and Jewish participation in a great socialist revolution that would put an end to social injustice that fed anti-Semitism. Herzl's growing self-awareness and self-pride are apparent in his most famous play, The New Ghetto, of 1894, written shortly before Alfred Dreyfus's first trial for espionage, which Herzl covered as the Paris correspondent of the Vienna newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse. Simultaneous events in Vienna, where the anti-Semitic city councilor and Christian socialist Karl Lueger was elected mayor, although not seated till 1897, sent Herzl into a delirious state, and he began to scribble in a diary a mixture of incoherent and brilliant thoughts that became the core of his pamphlet, The Jewish State. Herzl was hardly alone among Central European Jews in being exposed to anti-Semitism, but the overwhelming majority did not become Zionists. Anti-Semitism was a necessary but insufficient precondition behind Herzl's turn to Zionism. The other essential component was his own chronic state of psycho-emotional distress. Throughout his life, Herzl battled depression, and he freely acknowledged that only success, theatrical, journalistic, or political, could bring him out of his funk. And although Herzl did establish some friendships, in general it was extremely difficult for him to have close relations, especially romantic or erotic ones with others. Herzl's ability to form lasting and loving relationships was stunted by the death during Herzl's late teens of his sister Pauline and one Madeleine Herz, the daughter of family friends on whom he had an unrequited schoolboy crush. Herzl never had a sustained and intimate erotic relationship with an individual of either gender. As a young man, he had dalliances that left him physically disgusted by women and marred by gonorrhea. When he first met his future wife, Julie Naschauer, in 1886, erotic attraction elicited violent nausea and psychosomatic pain. Shortly after meeting Julie and being repelled by his attraction to her, Herzl developed an infatuation with the 14-year-old niece of the late Madeleine Herz. Intriguingly, in that same year, when he was undergoing this very deep sexual sort of eruption, as it were, Herzl published his first book of feuilleton, called News from Venus, in which Venus is associated with the distant and the unattainable, that which is enticing from afar, but loathsome when encountered up close. One of the most revealing stories in the collection, about a man who can read others' thoughts, goes on at length about the ease with which innocence turns into corruption. Herzl associated Venus, the goddess of erotic love, with a false idol, and preferred to dwell instead in the realm of chaste love, that for a pubescent girl, for example, or of his sister Pauline, who had died of typhus in 1878. Evidence to substantiate my assertion is Herzl's fascination with Richard Wagner's opera Tannhäuser. Herzl devoted a feuilleton to the opera in May of 1895, listened to it repeatedly while immersed in his manic fit of June of 1895, and had the overture played at the beginning of the Zionist Congress of 1898. That was the second Congress of 1898. Now, Tannhäuser tells the story of a man trapped by Venus in the Venusberg, the Mount of Venus, and who seeks to escape her spell for both earthly existence and the spiritual love of the chaste Elizabeth. Several scholars have written on Herzl's love of the opera, but they have tended to read it politically as an allegory on escape from the ghetto, the grotto of Venus, or the futility of assimilation, the petition to the Pope in the opera. But given Herzl's psychological baggage, it makes at least as much sense to read his engagement with the opera as a search for an escape from Venus, that is, his own stunted erotic life, as Zionism gave him a cause to which he could sacrifice himself completely, driving himself deliberately to an early death, just as Tannhäuser encounters a premature and tragic death, but also redemption. A final piece of evidence on this point is Herzl's late feuilleton, the short story from 1902 called The Beloved of Venus, about a retired Roman dictator, clearly an alter ego of Herzl, who has given up the responsibility of maintaining the Roman Empire and longs for simple and earthly pleasures. He is killed in the arms of his enemy's mistress. For Herzl, being the beloved of Venus was no good thing. Many of Herzl's feuilletons are coated in a sugary sentimentality, that does not fully conceal their bitter emotional core. In one of Herzl's best short tales, Sarah Holtzman, from 1896, the irretrievable girl-woman from Herzl's erotic past takes the form of a beautiful but sad-faced lass whose brassy and bejeweled mother is having an affair. The story is told by a friend of the family, a tortured and struggling artist whose love for the girl is both avuncular and romantic. In Sarah Holtzman, Herzl has clearly placed himself in the position of the narrator, as he does 6 years later in his story, The Reading Glasses, about a man approaching middle age with weakening vision. A rather blurred image of a young woman in a hotel salon reminds him of, yes, again, yet again, a 14-year-old girl whom he had loved in his youth. As a political thinker and leader, Herzl may have had a powerful vision of the Jewish future, but emotionally, Herzl remained fixated in the past. These writings do not tell us why Herzl became a Zionist, but they testify to a blocked and suffering emotional self that cannot be accounted for solely by exogenous factors like anti-Semitism. Herzl's emotional pain does not, of course, constitute a sufficient precondition for his turn to Zionism either. But two other emotions precluded alternatives. Pride kept him from favoring mass conversion. And fear of revolution, fear of anarchy, fear of the loss of the culture and the world that he knew and loved so well, kept him at arm's length from socialism. Now, Herzl could simply have had a total nervous breakdown, which his Zionist project managed to forestall until the frailties of his body, that is a congenital heart defect, overcame the weakness of his psyche, and he died tragically young at the age of 44. One could speak as well about Zionism as a means of allaying an overpowering sense of shame that haunted Herzl from his student days. Scholars have routinely placed this feeling under the rubric of Jewish self-hatred. But this term, Jewish self-hatred, does very little to explain why certain fin de siècle Jews were so much more vulnerable than others to a cytokine storm of disgust over alleged flaws in the Jewish character. Intriguingly, expressions of shame and its opposite, honor, rarely appear in Herzl's short stories written for general audiences, but they appear consistently in his Zionist writings, including his diaries and his novel, Alt Neuland. Perhaps it was only in writings intended explicitly for a Jewish audience that Herzl could openly confront these feelings, which were no less part of his psyche than the melancholy and the yearning that suffuse the feuilleton. Herzl's writings are filled with heroic men, possessed of noble sentiments, and what Herzl frequently referred to as icy calm. These figures were projections of his own self-fashioning, as psychologically exoskeletal, with a surface as hard and brilliant as his prose. In his pamphlet, The Jewish State, Herzl presents himself as a supremely rational human being who has not embraced Zionism as a passion, but has simply discovered it as a fact of nature, like a chemical element. He offers a cool, apparently detached diagnosis of and a cure for a deadly and heretofore ineradicable Judeophobia. Herzl claims that he approaches anti-Semitism, and he writes this, without fear or hatred. Those are his words. That is, without emotions, indicative of disequilibrium or psychological turbulence. He even sees in anti-Semitism, and I'm quoting Herzl, elements of legitimate self-defense. He writes, as emancipated Jews are well suited for commerce and the professions, and they present fierce competition to socially mobile Gentiles. In other words, for Herzl, anti-Semitism is not entirely irrational. It will behoove the anti-Semites to get rid of the Jews, and for this reason they will support Herzl's endeavor. Herzl writes in The Jewish State, quote, honest anti-Semites, whilst preserving their independence, will combine with our officials in controlling the transfer of our estates, end quote. Anti-Semites, he writes, will even buy shares in the economic arm of the Zionist enterprise, the Jewish company. The Zionists will repay their kindness by giving, quote, every assistance to governments and parliaments in their efforts to direct the inner migration of Christian citizens to formerly Jewish properties. The only emotion that Herzl displays in all of the book, or the pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, is pride, which is manifest in a yearning for honor. Deeply concerned about the reputation of Europe's Jews, Herzl writes, quote, "Every obligation in the old country must be scrupulously fulfilled before leaving. Every just private claim originating in the abandoned countries will be heard more readily in the Jewish state than anywhere else. We shall not wait for reciprocity. We shall act purely for the sake of our own honor." In one of the pamphlet's most famous passages, Herzl foresees the protection of the holy sites by, quote, "assigning to them an extraterritorial status, such as is well known in the law of nations. We shall form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence." So we detect a reservoir of urgency and sympathy underneath the text's straightforward presentation. It is the combination of superficial sang-froid and underlying desperation that makes the pamphlet so rhetorically effective. The emotional effect of the pamphlet may be gained from the reaction of Herzl's closest friend and ally in the Zionist movement, Max Nordau. And when I found the handwritten letter that Nordau sent to Herzl upon reading The Jewish State, Nordau had terrible handwriting in general. But this, you can see that he's like writing with such force that he's almost forcing the pen through the paper. And it's a long quotation. I won't read the whole thing, but I just want to read a couple of lines. "Your work is highly heroic in this more than brave, indeed utterly fearless, Todeskühne, recognition of an ultimate feeling which all Jews until now have borne in the deepest recesses of their soul. You must be able to empathize with me. Sie müssen es mir nachfühlen können, that I do this, that I react with such force." In the years to come, Herzl would be well aware of the emotional effect he had on his followers. Although somewhat wary of the adulation he received, he knew that the success of Zionism depended on the emotional energy of which he had become the cynosure. His carefully cultivated appearance, his stage management of the Zionist congresses, all of these were performative acts designed to attract the masses to his movement. Herzl himself would consistently cultivate coolness, even if he was boiling inside. And boil he did. With wounded pride when shunted aside by the German emperor or the Ottoman sultan, irritation and pique when confronted by obstreperous Russian Zionists on any number of issues, and most notoriously disgust with Jewish assimilationists. In his notorious essay from 1897, Mauscheln, Herzl employed an old German pejorative verb for the speaking of Judeo-German, inextricably linked with sharp dealing, cheating, and insincerity. Transforming the verb into a proper noun, Herzl writes of Mauschel, akin to kike, as a Jew without honor. Quote, "No true Jew can be an anti-Zionist. Only Mauschel can be one." We have seen that Herzl's Zionism was rooted in emotional distress and need, yet was expressed via a pseudo-technocratic language that connoted control over the passions. Herzl's persona combined passion and empathy on the one hand, and discipline and strength on the other. The former was embodied in his dark, deep-set eyes, which appeared to witness the tragic fate of the Jewish people, and the latter in his full, dark beard, which gave him the look of an ancient Near Eastern monarch. Herzl elicited awe from and instilled pride into his superiors. This affective circulation, by the way, between leader and led is typical of charismatic authority. By elevating antisemitism into a rational ideology, Herzl hoped to defeat it by spiriting away the irritant that lay at the ideology's source. Did it work? Herzl did enjoy some success among antisemites, including the Hungarian politician cum journalist Yvon von Simony and the notorious French journalist Édouard Drumont, who responded enthusiastically to the First Zionist Congress of 1897. For more than a decade, Drumont championed Zionism, not only because it would get the Jews out of Europe, but because Zionists were, he believed, men of honor who wanted to construct their own land rather than leech off the wealth of others. By 1913, however, Drumont had soured on Zionism, which had given up the Herzlian goal of a mass transfer of Jews to Palestine via the acquisition of an imperial charter. Drumont blamed this shift on Jewish plutocrats like Maurice de Hirsch, thus displaying complete ignorance of the inner sources of the transformation of Zionist methods and goals during the years following Herzl's death, as well as an insistence on forcing reality into preconceived notions about Jewish wealth and power. Since anti-Semitism was at heart an emotional manifestation reflecting socioeconomic disequilibrium, Herzl's attempts to elevate it to a rational discourse were doomed to fail. Herzl also encountered anti-Semitism in his diplomatic activity, particularly with his German and Russian interlocutors. The Chancellor and Foreign Secretary of Germany were both cold to him, and Kaiser Wilhelm II was wont to call Jews kikes, killers of Christ, and socialist revolutionaries. The Russian Interior Minister, Vyacheslav Pleva, was even more scornful. The British officials were less overtly anti-Semitic, and Herzl was able to win sufficient trust from the colonial and foreign secretaries to obtain an offer of territory in British East Africa. Herzl's diplomatic failures can't be attributed to anti-Semitism, however, but rather to the simple fact that in international relations, actors get what they want through threatening and bargaining, and Herzl had nothing to threaten with and little to offer. His only bargaining chip, Jewish financial support to restructure the Ottoman debt, was not sufficiently enticing to win Ottoman imperial support. Aside from threatening and bargaining, however, there is a third mechanism by which international actors try to get what they want, what Todd Hall from Oxford calls emotional diplomacy. International actors signal intentions to each other through displays of official emotion, which may or may not be genuinely felt, but which can indicate and justify major changes in foreign policy. Herzl, however, never mastered emotional diplomacy. His appeals to the great powers were primarily based in imperial self-interest and a developmental imperative. Only a decade after Herzl's death, the outbreak of World War I would change the geopolitical situation drastically, giving Chaim Weizmann not only something with which to bargain and threaten, but also a basis for an emotional diplomacy with Palestine's future protector, the United Kingdom. So now we come to part two. And this being 2017 and the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, it's about high time that we talk about 1917. Isaiah Berlin once remarked, like many visionaries, Herzl understood issues but not human beings. Herzl, according to Berlin, certainly did not understand the Eastern European Jewish masses, whereas Chaim Weizmann grasped their needs and articulated their views. Now, I must admit, this is a rather romanticized and simplified image of both masses and leaders, and I do not wish to add to the hagiographical literature on Weizmann that presents him as an earthy folk Jew whose soulful glance and sparkling wit encapsulated the spirit of the shtetl from which he came. Weizmann was much more complicated than that. He was, no less than Herzl, a flawed man, vain and insecure, prone to hypochondriasis, an absent father, and, unlike Herzl, a womanizer. Herzl did understand human beings, but only their externalities. As a journalist, he could describe the appearances and behaviors of people with great accuracy, but his attempts to penetrate their souls fell flat. Unlike Herzl, Weizmann possessed great empathy. He was sensitive in both meanings of the term, easily hurt, but also affectively bound up with his interlocutor. Whereas Herzl seized on Zionism as a drowning man grasps a life ring, Weizmann evinced a confident and unreflective Zionism from childhood onward. A product of traditional Eastern European Jewish society, Weizmann had no qualms thinking about the Jews as a collective. It was merely a matter of which solution to the Jewish problem he would adopt. 2 of his 12 siblings chose Bundism and communism, with tragic results. As Shalom Ratzabi has written, as a student in Germany, Weizmann's naive love of Zion became more analytical and sophisticated, but he became neither an original thinker nor a polemicist. You know, when you read books on the intellectual history of Zionism, it's interesting that Weizmann doesn't appear, although he was this major. Ben-Gurion shows up, interestingly, Weizmann doesn't. Even though he did think, and he wrote programmatic essays, but his main talents were, of course, organizational and political. Like Herzl, Weizmann possessed the qualities of both transformational and transactional leadership. There's a whole field of leadership studies. So transformational leadership means you inspire people. Transactional leadership means you get things done. These are in books with great titles like How to Be Charismatic. They're American. They're American books, by the way. In the UK, these books would just fall flat. Whereas Herzl was tormented, Weizmann was merely troubled. Weizmann communicated as much via emotional signals as by direct references to raison d'etat. In his conversations with British government figures, Weizmann consistently blended the historic wrongs committed against the Jews, which evoked pity and compassion, with their antiquity, morality, and contributions to civilization, which elicited admiration and respect. Weizmann encountered complicated mixtures of antisemitism and philo-Semitism. At the outset of the war, Gerald Henry Fitzmaurice, former British dragoman in Constantinople, proposed that the Allies offer Palestine to the Dunmes, who in his view dominated the Young Turk government. Only as the war dragged on did these fantasies of Jewish power take the form of German Jews sabotaging their country's war effort, or American Jews pushing the United States into war, or Russian Jews keeping their country in the fighting in the wake of the March 1917 revolution. Arthur James Balfour, meeting Weizmann in December of 1914, and hearing Weizmann present a threnody on the Jews' legacy of suffering, was moved, quote, to tears, or so Weizmann wrote to Ahad Ha'am shortly after their meeting. He was moved to tears in italics. And I'm quoting now Weizmann to Ahad Ha'am. And he took me by the hand and said I had illuminated for him the road followed by a great suffering nation. Now, did this in fact happen? I mean, there's a certain point where we have to assume, at least, as the economists would say, that this happened. Because 3 years later, after the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, Balfour himself described Jews much more clinically as, quote, exceedingly clever people who, in spite of their oppression, achieved a certain success which excited the jealousy and envy of the peoples among whom they lived. Well aware of his own interlocutors' potential for jealousy and envy, Weizmann exploited myths of Jewish power to discredit the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, accusing him of leading, quote, an international ring of Jewish financiers in Hamburg, Berlin, Vienna, Paris, and New York. That's Weizmann's words, who plotted a German victory and both German and German Jewish ascendancy in Ottoman Palestine. And why am I bringing this all up? Scholars have written at great length about the various factors that led to the Balfour Declaration. The vast majority of scholarship subordinates compassion to raison d'etat, and rightly so. Yet they underestimate the significance of what Todd Hall, whom I referred to earlier, would call a specific type of emotional diplomacy, the diplomacy of sympathy. To be sure, Weizmann offered international Jewish support for the British war effort. He played upon anti-Semitic overestimations of Jewish unity and Jewish power. I grant that. Nor did he hide the fact that the Zionists were pursuing the support of other powers. In other words, he was bargaining, and he was threatening, as state or state-seeking actors always behave in the international arena. What then was the added value of emotional expression, such as Weizmann's sorrowful renditions of Jewish history, Balfour's tears, or Balfour's denotation at the outset of the Declaration that His Majesty's government views with sympathy the establishment of a Jewish national home? In emotional diplomacy, the actors believe that their expressions of feeling will be welcomed by their interlocutor. In order to succeed, the signals must appear sincere and indicate a willingness to make significant commitments or sacrifices. And sure enough, the Declaration represented a vast commitment, in return for which Weizmann and his Zionist partners were called upon to be of equally vast service. Dismissing the emotional component of these negotiations does nothing to explain why this component existed in the first place. Why didn't the British and the Zionists simply talk in terms of naked interest, of quid pro quo? The emotional signals and the tangible consequences of those signals are means of indicating sincerity, which foster agreement between state or state-seeking actors, thus addressing the fundamental problem that lies at the basis of all international relations, that is, the inability to fathom another actor's intentions for good or ill. Now, I've spoken thus far of the emotional signals that Weizmann and the British elite sent each other, but the emotional impact of the Balfour Declaration upon the Jewish public also deserves consideration. Throughout the Jewish world, the Declaration won exclaims of joy, exclamations that need to be unpacked to catch their deeper meaning. Gratitude, the word gratitude shows up an awful lot when you read 1918, 1919 articles in the Jewish press about Jews' feelings towards Britain. Even the conjoint committee of the Anglo-Jewish Association and the Board of Jewish Deputies, which had vociferously opposed Weizmann during the war, noted the gratitude felt by Jews the world over to the British. Weizmann himself enthusiastically called the Balfour Declaration a Jewish Magna Carta. The American Jewish newspaper, the Maccabean, did the same, as did the decidedly non-Jewish Lord Curzon. Now, this invocation is striking. Magna Carta was a concession of aristocratic privileges by an unpopular king to his rebellious barons. Its appearance in Zionist discourse connotes not only feelings of gratitude or pride or security and self-confidence, but also a certain servility. I mean, it's this combination. It's given by the king, which means on the one hand you're getting this charter, on the other hand it's coming from the king. I think it was John Quincy Adams who dismissed Magna Carta as something given by grace, this charter of Runnymede given by grace, unlike the American Declaration of Independence, which was the product of the people. Manifestations of these newfound positive emotions, expressing states of fulfilled longing, or in this case, imminent expectations of fulfillment, right? The Balfour Declaration arouses all these hopes of imminent redemption of the Jews. At the end of 1918, a declaration by the American Jewish Congress urged that Jews have, quote, complete and unhampered independence in their own land. The Congress's December 1918 call for a Jewish commonwealth, that is a state, was evoked by the Poelei Zion, workers of Zion, in their convention in Philadelphia at the same time. I'm quoting the Poelei Zion. We demand an independent, neutral, internationally guaranteed republic under the protection of the League of Nations. In February of 1919, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, one of American Jewry's most prominent leaders, spoke with assurance about a forthcoming trusteeship on behalf of the Jews. Now, the clarity and frequency with which American Zionists spoke of statehood for Palestine should come as no surprise, given that affirmations of Zionism came from America's highest leaders. The United States Congress passed a pro-Zionist resolution in December of 1918. They did so again in May of 1922. In March of 1919, Woodrow Wilson, addressing a group of prominent American Jews in Washington, said, "I am persuaded that the Allied nations, with the fullest concurrence of our government and people, are agreed that in Palestine shall be laid the foundation of a Jewish commonwealth." Later that summer, Wilson assured Stephen S. Wise, quote, "Have no fear, Palestine will be yours." Now, what this means, imagine the world, we're now at the end of 1918, we're going into 1919, Paris Peace Conference and so forth, and I've talked about emotions such as gratitude, pride, expectation, anticipation, and a very sort of, again, a sense of the near attainment of a long-desired goal. I believe that for many Jews, the most powerful emotional consequence in this period of the Balfour Declaration was the setting aside of fear. The massive suffering they had endured during and especially after the war, in the blood-soaked realm between the Baltic and Black Seas, would be redeemed by the new Jewish national home, whose Jews, and by extension, Jews everywhere, would live in a state of bodily and emotional calm. As we know, more than 30 years separated the issuing of the Balfour Declaration from the establishment of the State of Israel. The Declaration did not staunch anti-Semitism. Quite the opposite, it intensified it. Unlike Herzl, whose diplomatic accomplishments were meager and so attracted only a sidelong glance from anti-Semites, Weizmann won for the Jewish claim on Palestine the recognition of the world's mightiest empire. Anti-Semites were alarmed. The Declaration elicited all emotions that lie at the core of modern anti-Semitism: resentment over status inequities, hatred due to perceived wrongs, and despair engendered by a sense of powerlessness. So now I entered the third and the shortest part of my paper, which is specifically about anti-Semitic reactions to the Balfour Declaration, and so a discussion of anti-Semitic emotions and the hardening of these emotions into a new form of lethal ideology. In France, during the early interwar period, the far right was fiercely anti-British, and its activists saw in the Balfour Declaration proof of an Anglo-Zionist conspiracy to deprive France of its rightful imperial presence. For this reason, some rightists praised Zionist demands for statehood, which I talked about earlier, as a form of resistance to British imperialism, and hence keeping with French interests in the Middle East after France was awarded the League of Nations mandate for Syria and Lebanon. In Germany, however, which was crushed by the World War and saw its territory reduced and its overseas empires stripped away, Zionism received no such positive evaluations. As we learn from the important work of Francis Nicosia, and I'm very sorry that he can't be with us for this conference, the Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg wrote in the early 1920s that the World War had been initiated by Jews in order to obtain a state in Palestine. Yet since they are incapable of any of the creative or administrative labor required for statecraft, what the Jews called a state would really be a power base for their global and nefarious economic operations. On this view, there was no Anglo-Zionist conspiracy. Rather, the Jews enlisted the British as willing dupes. For a defeated people, the anti-Semitic trope of Jewish omnipotence was a discursive correlate to a feeling of German powerlessness. Intriguingly, however, the most sustained anti-Semitic treatment of the Balfour Declaration did not come from defeated Germany, but from the victorious United States, and its author is probably unknown to most of the people in this room. William J. Cameron, an unprepossessing journalist from Hamilton, Ontario, sometimes student at the University of Toronto, I'm sorry to say, would never have been known to history had he not left the Detroit News in 1918 to work for Henry Ford, whom he served between 1921 and 1927 as editor of the Dearborn Independent, and for whom he continued to work until 1946. Cameron was effectively Ford's spokesperson and media handler. He was an adherent, and until the early 1940s, a leader of the British Israelite movement, which avowed that the 10 lost tribes of Israel were the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons, and that the Jews are descended from Judah, a mongrel Asiatic race. Cameron wrote all or most of the articles in the Dearborn Independent between May of 1920 and March of 1922 that were later collected and published under the title The International Jew. In recorded reminiscence by the Ford Oral History Project in 1952, Cameron claimed to have been disgusted by his assignment to write anti-Semitic pieces. Yet contemporary evidence suggests that he wrote these articles with great gusto. According to one scholar, Cameron's, quote, involvement with anti-Semitism in the early 1920s was neither nominal nor reluctant, end quote. At least 3 times in the 1920s, Cameron met with Nazi agent Kurt Lüdecke, who had been sent to the United States to mobilize support. There was no daylight between Cameron and Ford, with whom he lunched every day with Ford's son, Edsel, in the Ford factory private dining room. The Independent's issue of 28 May 1921 was devoted to the Balfour Declaration. It begins, quote, when the British Army passed into Jerusalem in the memorable capture of the city in 1917, the protocols of the elders of Zion went with it. The article then goes on to explain Zionism's pernicious aspects. Quote, there are 3 elements of danger in the situation as it exists today. The overwhelmingly predominant Bolshevik element that is being poured into Palestine, the intense egotistic and challenging nationalism that Zionists exhibit even before they get a potato patch, the taste for world politics and world power, and the racial confusion which now exists in Palestine, end quote. For Cameron, Zionism serves the interests of both Jewish capital and Jewish Bolshevism, which are linked in what the former fear the latter, or that the former fear the latter and want to be spared their wrath. So in other words, Jewish capitalists are afraid of Jewish Bolsheviks, and so they're helping the Jewish Bolsheviks. The government of Palestine, according to Cameron, is Jewish, headed by the Zionists, Sir Herbert Samuel, and Vladimir Jabotinsky, whom Cameron calls a Bolshevik, is treated as a dignitary, even though he organized attacks against defenseless Arabs, whom the Jews are trying to drive out of the country. Cameron displays sympathy to Palestine's Arabs, who are being purloined, and claims that the Declaration's clause about protecting the civil and religious rights of the natives was inserted to appease Jewish non-Zionists. Now, this is a very interesting variant of 20th century anti-Semitism, in that it acknowledges a divide between Zionist and non-Zionist Jews. It equates Zionism with Bolshevism and non-Zionism with capitalism, and it posits a struggle between them, a struggle that the Zionist Bolsheviks are determined to win. This typology is evocative of the Red Scare in the United States in the immediate post-war era. Like so many anti-Semites, Cameron is afraid of the Jews, and he implores Christian philo-Semites not to be mollified by the Jews' honeyed claims to be restoring their biblical homeland. Cameron asserts that the Jews who are invading Palestine are not the Israelites of old. Cameron's critique of Zionism dovetails perfectly with his British Israelism, an assertion of Anglo-Saxon racial authenticity and antiquity. If the Red Scare was a mass manifestation of fear, scare, British Israelism was an expression of only slightly less charged emotions: anxiety over the changing ethnic makeup of the United States and loss of hegemony, and of course resentment against the economic success of non-WASPs. In 1920, Cameron had reproduced comments from 1903 by Herzl and Nordau, in which both men had spoken of a world war, British imperial ascendancy in the Middle East, and a future peace settlement by which the Jews would obtain Palestine. Cameron implied that the Zionists had planned the war for their benefit. He appears to be unaware that talk about a future world war and its consequences was commonplace at the fin de siècle. Intriguingly, Cameron's outlandish claims were repeated in the final text I will analyze today, a lengthy critique of the Balfour Declaration written by Robert John and published in the Journal of Historical Review in 1985. Now, as you may know, this journal is devoted to pseudo-scholarship, and it promotes Holocaust denial. It was perhaps a surprising venue for Robert John, a British lawyer and co-author with Sami Hadawi, who served as director of the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut, of the Palestine Diary, British, American, and United Nations Intervention, 1914 to 1948, a book published in 1970 with an introduction by Arnold Toynbee. Although well-written and littered with footnotes, the article I'm referring to takes at face value British, German, and French governmental estimations of the value of and need for Jewish public support, and the equation of pro-Zionism with Jewish financial assistance on the one hand, and the endorsement of global Jewry on the other. John claims that by 1916, the war was draining all sides, and a negotiated peace would have been reached but for American entry into the war, which was instigated by the Jews for their benefit, including the attainment of Palestine. John argues that Wilson decided to go to war several months before the German declaration of unrestricted U-boat warfare and the notorious Zimmermann telegram, which revealed a German-Mexican plot to invade the United States. Relying heavily on the memoirs of James Malcolm, a British subject and Armenian nationalist activist, John writes that Wilson was pushed into the war by Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who only obtained his seat on the court as a result of blackmail for love letters written to his neighbor's wife while serving as president of Princeton University. Blackmail Woodrow Wilson for love letters written by Wilson to his neighbor's wife while serving as president of Princeton. According to the story, which John just reproduces quite matter-of-factly, since Woodrow Wilson did not have the $40,000 demanded of him, his go-between, Samuel Untermeyer, of the law firm of Guggenheim, Untermeyer, and Marshall, said he would provide the funds if Wilson would appoint to the next vacancy on the Supreme Court any nominee selected by Mr. Untermeyer. According to John, quote, "The money was paid, the letters were returned, and Brandeis was the nominee." Now, unlike Cameron, John does not posit a split between Bolshevik and capitalist Jews. Not only did American German Jewish bankers support the March Russian Revolution by loaning funds to Russia, John argues that Jacob Schiff and other Jewish financiers may have supported the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, as they returned from the United States and Switzerland, respectively, to Russia. John does admit to a sharp clash between Zionists and a non-Zionist financial elite, between Lucian Wolff and the English Zionist Federation, and between Edward Montague and English Zionists. But John blames the failure of initiatives for a separate peace with the Ottoman Empire entirely on Chaim Weizmann, who, as I mentioned above, scotched the Morgenthau mission via innuendo about noxious Jewish financial power. John reproduces, without any sort of reservations, the memoirs of a former State Department official named William Yale, who claims that at the time of the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, Weizmann threatened, should the declaration not be forthcoming, to, quote, smash the British Empire as we smashed the Russian Empire, end quote. Now, to be fair, given Weizmann's willingness to play upon British views of Jewish financial and political power, it is conceivable that he did say this. It's conceivable, or something along those lines. But Weizmann should not be blamed for the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories propounded by John or 6 decades previously by Cameron. We see in both writers baseless claims emanating from a fear and hatred of Jews. The term Judeophobia, Judenhass in German, a far more accurate term to describe such sentiments than the sanitized word antisemitism, coined around 1879 by the journalist Wilhelm Marr in order to lend ideological gravitas to his animosity against Jews. John's account of the alleged blackmail of President Wilson maintains the tradition of associating Jews with criminality and sexual depravity. Surely John did the Palestinian cause no good by raising it in a deeply flawed article in a journal that espouses Holocaust denial. Doing so makes it all too easy to link the all too real sufferings endured by the Palestinians with the imaginary complaints of European anti-Semites. It is not surprising, albeit disheartening, that some supporters of the Palestinian cause can and do repeat old anti-Semitic canards. What is more interesting and more relevant for my focus this evening is the extent to which all oppressed peoples, including Palestinians, and anti-Semites can share a common emotional vocabulary consisting of feelings such as fear, resentment, hatred, and anger. And I think that for oppressed peoples, shame and frustration carry a particularly heavy burden because such feelings usually arise when one deals with a bona fide act of victimization and an inability or unwillingness to avenge it or seek redress. And although anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic discourses are often compared, let's not forget that Zionism and antisemitism can also be linked together. As I said at the outset, Zionism and antisemitism, being varieties of nationalism and racism, share a swath of negative emotions. Moreover, like other forms of racism, antisemitism is virtually free from positive emotions. How many anti-Semites employ their arguments as expressions of love, pride, and joy? All nationalisms can be cruel. All can be exclusionary. Zionism is no exception. But they can be inspirational and inculcate into humanity a yearning for achievement and solidarity. Perhaps it is wrong for people to love their nations, but love them they often do. Whether that love is naive, as it was for Weizmann, or sentimental, as it was for Herzl, Zionism has constructed an affective matrix and a national home that has given sustenance to millions of Jews psychically as well as physically. Anti-Semitism, too, can provide people with a sense of emotional satisfaction in that it accounts for their personal or collective failures or humiliations. But its therapeutic powers are feeble unless it is stoked into a frenzy and hardened into an ideological casing which has disastrous consequences. Thank you very much.